My name is Celestine Warrens. I am 36 years old, and I learned what my family actually thought of me from a hospital gurney on a Tuesday night in November, while a nurse was still cutting away my sleeve. 7 weeks before that night, I had given birth to my son, Eli. He came into the world at 6:14 in the morning, after 19 hours of labor that my mother skipped because, in her words, she had already done her part by raising me, and didn't see why she needed to be there for the hard part all over again. I remember lying in that delivery room with my husband Marcus beside me, and thinking, fine, okay, I will do this the way I do everything. I will do it myself, and I will do it well, and we will never talk about it. 7 weeks later, a delivery truck jumped the Meridian on Lakeshore Drive. While I was driving home from a late conference call I'd taken from the parking garage because the office Wi-Fi had cut out. The driver ran a stop sign I never even saw. I woke up with a fractured collarbone, a deep laceration along my left forearm that took 11 stitches, and a concussion that made the overhead lights feel like ice picks behind my eyes. The paramedics had already called Marcus. He was in Phoenix, 4 hours away, on a regional flight that didn't board for another 90 minutes. Someone needed to be with Eli. My mother lived 14 minutes from that hospital. 14 minutes. I know, because I had timed it once on a Sunday afternoon, turning it over in my mind the way you do when you have a newborn and no local support, and you're trying to believe the net is there, even if you never test it. She said no. She didn't say it to me. She said it to Marcus when he called her from the departure gate, with Eli's monitor beeping on speaker in the background, and his voice barely holding together. She said, and these are the exact words he gave me later, when I asked him to repeat them twice so I could be absolutely sure. She said, I'm at bingo with a vet. Priya manages fine without anyone. She always has. That's just who she is. That's just who she is. Not your grandson is 7 weeks old. Not my daughter is lying in a hospital. Not, of course, I'm coming. Just a clean, comfortable explanation for why she did not have to move. I was the kind of person who managed, and the people who manage, they have decided, do not actually need anything. They just keep managing. There was a second sentence. Marcus gave it to me gently, the way you hand someone a piece of glass. He said my sister Danielle was at a spa weekend in Sedona she had been planning for 2 months, and that my mother had told him it wouldn't be right to interrupt that, because Danielle had been so stressed lately. Danielle had been stressed. I had a fractured collarbone and 11 stitches and a 7-week-old son, and my mother was protecting my sister's spa weekend. I want to tell you what I did in the next 4 minutes, because this is the part nobody expects. I did not cry. I did not call her back and beg. I did not stare at the ceiling and feel sorry for myself, which would have been completely reasonable, and which I chose not to do because it would have cost me time, and I did not have time. I had a list, and the first item on the list was my son. I asked the nurse for my phone, and she handed it to me, and I called a pediatric night care agency Marcus and I had registered with before Eli was born, back when I was still the kind of person who planned for emergencies that felt unlikely. A man answered, and I told him my name and my address and my situation, in under 10 sentences. I need an overnight nurse for a 7-week-old, starting within the hour. My husband is flying in from Phoenix. I am in the hospital. The baby is healthy. I am not. He said someone would be there in 45 minutes. Her name was Louisa. She texted me a photo of Eli's feet in her hands 48 minutes later, and the photo was so ordinary and so safe that I held it on the screen for a long time without blinking. The nurse who had been monitoring me glanced over and asked if my family was on their way. It's handled, I said. She gave me the look, the one people give you when you refuse to perform the distress they've arranged themselves to receive. I wasn't being hard, I was triaging. My son was safe, my husband was boarding, my collarbone would heal. There was exactly one item left on my list, and it had been sitting there for 8 years, untouched, gathering weight the way debt gathers weight when you refuse to look at the balance. I opened my banking app. The screen glowed bluish-white in the dark bay, and I navigated with my right thumb, moving through the menus the way you move through a kitchen you know by feel. I want to tell you who I was before that night, because it explains everything about why this worked the way it worked, and why it needed to work that way. I grew up in a rental house in Decatur with 3 people who all had opinions about money, and none of whom were ever willing to earn enough of it to match those opinions. My father left when I was 11. Not dramatically. He just one day was there, and the next day wasn't. And my mother explained his absence the way she explained everything inconvenient, which is to say, she made it a story about how she had suffered. I paid for my own school supplies starting at 13 by taking a weekend job at a copy center. I got a partial scholarship to a state university and worked 30 hours a week to cover the rest. I graduated with a degree in accounting at 22 and a job offer at a mid-sized financial firm in Chicago before the ink was dry. By 30, I was a senior analyst. By 34, I was running a team of 6. I lived inside numbers the way some people live inside music. I understood compound interest and depreciation schedules and the long, quiet math of how money moved when no one was watching. And for 8 years, I had been the reason my family's money moved at all. It started the month after I got my first real raise. My mother called me crying about a water heater, and I transferred $800 and felt, I will be honest with you, I felt good about it. I felt like someone who had made it, and was now doing the right thing with having made it. That is a feeling I want to name for you clearly, because I think a lot of people have had that feeling and mistaken it for wisdom, when it was actually just the first step in a very long staircase going down. The transfers became regular. First, it was my mother's rent supplement, $1,200 a month because she was in a lease she couldn't quite afford and had a fixed income from a part-time pharmacy job she took 3 days a week. Then it was Danielle's car note, because she had taken a job that required driving, and the job, she said, would change everything. Then there was what I thought was my mother's medical expense account, a category I set up and labeled health, because she had a thyroid condition and prescription costs were real. Then there was the general one, the one simply labeled FAM, that I set up during a period when things were particularly hard and never got around to canceling. 4 transfers, $3,800 a month, 8 years. I had never said the total out loud. I had never let myself look at the total the same way I imagine a person with a drinking problem doesn't look at the bottles lined up in a row. Because looking at the row means counting the row, and counting the row means knowing something you are not yet willing to know. So in that hospital bay, with the monitor counting my pulse, and Luisa's photo of Eli's feet still warm on my screen, I made myself look. The app totaled it without sentiment. $365,200. I read it twice. $365,000. Almost exactly $1 for every day of 8 years, which is the kind of coincidence that feels like the universe making a point. And then, because I am who I am, I pressed cancel on the first transfer. A small green confirmation appeared. Recurring transfer canceled. I pressed the second. Recurring transfer canceled. Third. Fourth. 4 taps, maybe 30 seconds, and 8 years simply went quiet. I felt no explosion, no triumph, no grief, no dramatic internal swell, just the specific physical feeling of a weight leaving your hands when you set it down on a surface. A flat and complete relief. And then, because I was still in the app, I scrolled back through the health category the way you pick at something you're not sure about, and I found it. Buried 14 months back in a string of small pharmacy charges and 2 insurance copays. A single transfer that did not belong. $2,000. Recipient notation, D home, Danielle's initial. Not my mother's thyroid medication, my sister. I closed the app and lay in the dark and thought about that for a long time. Before Luisa could text me again, before the doctor came back to discuss my discharge timeline, before any of that, my phone lit up with a FaceTime call. It was Danielle. She was calling from Sedona. I could see terracotta-colored light and the edge of a robe behind her. She looked relaxed in a way I had not seen her look in years, which told me the spa was working. She also did not appear to know that I was in a hospital bed, or that her mother had just declined to cover her nephew's care, which told me she hadn't spoken to our mother in the past 2 hours. "Hey," she said, "is everything okay? I tried to pay for the upgrade package and the card got flagged." She meant the shared card my mother maintained that I quietly reloaded every month under the FAM transfer. The one Danielle thought of as a family resource the way you think of a creek as a resource, something that is just there, flowing, because nature provided it. I looked at the ceiling. "Danielle," I said, "I'm actually in the hospital right now." A beat. Wait, what? Why? Is it the baby? No, I was in a car accident tonight. Eli is home with a nurse. I'm okay. Another beat. Longer. Oh my God, are you serious? She sat forward and the terracotta light shifted. What happened? Are you hurt? Fractured collarbone. Stitches. Concussion, I said. She said, that's awful. Oh my God, I'm so glad you're okay. And then, after a pause that I timed internally, 5 seconds, maybe 6, she said, so is it a bank thing with the card, or is it something you changed? 5 seconds. I want you to hold that number. I told her I would look into the card situation and that I had to rest now, and I hung up before she could respond. Because some things take longer than a phone call to understand, and my sister was going to need to sit with what she'd just asked before any conversation between us would mean anything. I did not know then that the card question was the least of what Danielle was about to discover about herself. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital at 7, with Eli in the car seat and Louisa walking alongside him down the corridor, because she had offered to stay 1 more hour while he navigated the parking structure. He came around the curtain and looked at me, and I watched him process the collarbone brace and the stitched arm and the fading bruise along my jaw. At his face stood a slow, careful collapse that he immediately tried to reverse. I said, don't, or you'll start me. He set Eli on my chest, careful of the brace, and for about 3 minutes we did not speak at all. That is the one part of that week I would choose to live again if I could. Then my phone started vibrating on the tray table. My mother. I let it go twice. On the 3rd ring, Marcus raised his eyebrows. I picked up. Her voice was warm and thick, the Sunday morning voice she reserves for moments she needs something from me. Celestine, honey, I have been just sick with worry. Why didn't you call me last night? I told her Marcus had called her last night and she had been at bingo. A pause. Well, I didn't realize how serious it was, she said, which was the first lie, followed immediately by, you always handle everything so well. I didn't want to leave Yvette stranded. She took the bus. Then she shifted, smooth as a gear change, into the territory I had been expecting. She asked whether the account transfers had been paused because of the hospital situation, because she was going to need the first of the month deposit, and she had a dental appointment she'd already scheduled. A dental appointment. I told her the transfers weren't paused. They were canceled. 3 seconds of silence. What do you mean canceled? I mean I went into the app and I pressed cancel 4 times. I said, the way I would describe a spreadsheet correction to someone who didn't understand accounting. Her voice dropped. The warmth came off it, like a coat coming off. Celestine, after everything I have done for you, I raised you alone. I kept the lights on. You have no idea what I sacrificed. I said, I'll talk to you when you're ready to have a different kind of conversation. And I hung up, which I had never done in 36 years of being her daughter. Marcus looked at me. She'll call back, I said. In 11 minutes, I said. She called back in 8. I let it go. That afternoon, my mother posted to the family group thread. I had forgotten the thread existed. It contained my Aunt Josephine, 3 cousins I spoke to at Christmas, 2 great-aunts who used it primarily to share devotional images, and apparently my mother, who had been waiting for a stage. The message was long. I will summarize, because the content was not original. She wrote that her eldest daughter had cut off her struggling, aging mother without warning and without pause. She wrote that she had given everything to her children and had been met with cruelty. She wrote that she had always managed on her own, a phrase I noted, the way you note a recurring error in a dataset. She wrote that her health was delicate and that she did not know how she would manage her medical expenses now. She asked the family to pray for her. 3 minutes later, Aunt Josephine replied with the broken heart emoji and the words, she has always been the difficult one. I read that. I read it twice and felt the familiar surge of the old reflex, the need to explain myself, to soften the picture, to send a long, thoughtful message that laid out my reasoning in a way the family could follow. To manage as I had managed everything. I put the phone face down on the tray table. The new me, the one that had apparently been born sometime between the Meridian and the Gurney, wanted something cleaner than an explanation. I was an analyst. Analysts don't explain the data. They show the data and let it explain itself. I was still in the hospital when the second unexpected thing happened. Marcus had gone to get coffee, and I was lying with Eli half asleep on my good shoulder, when the door to my room opened, and a woman I had not seen in 14 months walked in. Her name was Genevieve Okafor. She was 64 years old, my mother's older sister, the one the family called difficult because she had opinions and bank accounts and did not combine them with sentiment. She was tall and wore her natural silver hair short, and she carried a canvas bag over one arm and did not ask if this was a good time. She looked at me, at the brace and the stitches, and then at Eli. "Who came?" she asked. "Louisa from the agency," I said. "Your mother?" I shook my head. She set her bag down. She sat in the plastic chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap with the same composed economy of motion that had always made her seem more substantial than the room she was in. Then she said, "I know about the money." I looked at her. "Not just the transfer," she said. "All of it. I've known for almost 2 years. I asked her how. She said my mother had made the mistake of calling her 3 years ago to borrow money, which Genevieve had declined to lend. My mother in response had implied that it didn't matter because Celestine was handling everything. She said it the way you say the phrase that tips your hand without knowing it. Celestine handles everything. Celestine always handles everything. Genevieve had gone home that evening and started asking quiet questions. She had a methodical mind, she told me, always had. She had called 2 people and spent a week on one particular piece of paperwork, and when she had found what she was looking for, she had not confronted my mother, because, as she explained, confrontation gives a dishonest person time to prepare. She had waited. She looked at Eli sleeping on my shoulder. "I didn't know when you'd be ready," she said. "I wasn't going to push it. But your mother called Linda Pierce this morning, and Linda called me, and I decided ready was today." She reached into the canvas bag. She took out a manila envelope. She set it on the end of the bed with the calm of a person who has been carrying something a long time and is relieved to set it down. "I didn't open it that night," she said. "I had enough to carry, and that there would be a right time for the envelope, and the right time was not while I was still wearing a hospital bracelet and holding a 7-week-old child. But she told me what was in it, or enough of what was in it, that I lay awake for hours after she left, rearranging everything I thought I knew about the past 8 years and what I had actually purchased with $365,000. She told me about Danielle first. I want to stay with that number a moment longer before I tell you about the envelope, because I think there's something important in how I had avoided it. $365,000. I had earned that money across 8 years at a desk, in quarterly reviews, in performance cycles I treated like examinations I was not willing to fail. I had stayed late on nights Marcus made dinner alone. I had taken calls from the parking garage. I had passed on a larger apartment 3 years running because we were trying to be careful, trying to build a margin. And for 8 of those years, I had been quietly draining that margin into a household I believed I was helping stabilize. The word I want to give you is believed. I believed my mother was supplementing a real fixed income with my transfers. I believed the health category was covering a genuine medical condition. I believed Danielle's car note was a bridge loan to a job that would eventually make her self-sufficient. I believed these things the way you believe a story that has never been fact-checked because the person telling it is your mother, and some rooms you don't walk into because you have decided you cannot afford what you might find. The morning after Genevieve's visit, when the unit printer actually worked, and Marcus was walking Eli in the corridor, I did what I do. I opened my laptop on the rolling tray table, and I built a spreadsheet. I exported 8 years of statements and dropped them into a pivot table sorted by recipient and subcategory and date range. I had run financial audits on companies with revenues north of $300 million. I could certainly audit my own life. What assembled itself on that screen, cell by careful cell, was not the picture my mother had been painting for 14 years of Sunday phone calls. The rent supplement I had been sending her for 8 years, $1,400 a month, went to her actual rent exactly 6 times in the first year. After that, the landlord's records, which Genevieve had obtained through a quiet conversation with a property manager she happened to know, showed her rent had been covered by her own income for the past 6.5 years. She had negotiated the rate down and never told me. The $1,400 simply continued landing in her account on the first of every month and being absorbed somewhere else. The health category, $900 a month, which I had labeled and monitored and felt virtuous about, broke down this way. I could document roughly $42,000 in genuine prescriptions and specialist visits across the full 8 years. The rest, a number I will give you plainly, the rest was $74,000 that left her account in cash, in amounts small enough not to trigger anything, and in patterns that, once I mapped them geographically, clustered within 3 miles of the Riverside Casino in Hammond, Indiana. My mother had not been managing her medical costs. My mother had been managing a gambling habit that I had been funding for nearly a decade, while she told my Aunt Josephine she managed on her own. And then there was Danielle. Danielle was 29. She had 14,000 Instagram followers, a photography hobby she had decided was a career, and a financial life I had been underwriting since she was 23, without fully understanding how completely I was underwriting it. The car note I had been covering, $680 a month, had been paid off for 3 years. The car was paid. The payment had continued going to my mother's account under the same label. 3 years of car payments on a car that no longer had a note. 45 months multiplied by $680. I will let you do that math. The $2,000 D-home transfer I had found in the health category was not an isolated event. Genevieve's careful questions had turned up 3 more. Different labels, different months, all within the past 2 years. A total of $9,000 moved to Danielle under category names that had nothing to do with Danielle, tucked into my mother's account inflows and rerouted before the month was out. And the FAM transfer, the general one I had set up and never canceled, that $1,200 a month, had funded 2 of Danielle's camera equipment purchases, a trip to Oaxaca she had documented for content, and most precisely, a studio rental deposit she had paid for in October of the previous year when she had texted me excitedly about a major opportunity without mentioning who was financing it. I did not know any of this because I had never asked. And I had never asked because I had decided years ago that being the person who funded things quietly was better than being the person who had opinions about what the funding was for. Opinions meant conversations. Conversations meant conflict. Conflict meant the family might decide I was difficult. I had been so afraid of being called difficult that I had purchased 8 years of silence with $365,000. I printed the summary, 1 page, 11 rows, every category, every total, every cluster. Then I opened the manila envelope. If you feel my words, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me, from which city are you listening right now? I want to see how far a woman's voice can actually reach. Help me build this community, because we have so many more stories to tell. The envelope contained 4 things. The first was a property document. My grandmother's house, the one on Elmore Street where I had spent every summer until I was 15, where she had taught me to read a bank statement before I could drive. The house I had assumed my mother had inherited and quietly sold years ago had not been sold. It was in a trust. The trust had been established 16 months before my grandmother died, meaning she had done it while she was still clear enough to do it deliberately and with intent. My grandmother's name was Dorothea, Dorothy to her friends, Grandma Dot to me. She had been a bookkeeper for 31 years at a shipping company in Gary, Indiana. She kept her own ledgers and composition notebooks, a different one for every year, on a shelf in her kitchen, the way other people keep cookbooks. She had raised 3 children and buried 1 husband, and never once in my memory spoken about money in a way that suggested it was anything other than a system you either understood or suffered under. The summer I turned 14, she had sat me down at her kitchen table and taught me how to read a credit card statement. Not in a general way. She went line by line. She showed me the interest calculation. She showed me the minimum payment trap. She said, "The people who stay poor are not stupid. They're just reading the wrong version of this document." She was the only person in my family I had never had to explain myself to. The trust document listed her property, her savings accounts, and a specific investment portfolio she had maintained for 20 years, as being held in trust with Genevieve Okafor as trustee. The beneficiary was not my mother. The beneficiary was me. Beside my name in the document was a handwritten note on the law firm's letterhead, clearly not part of the official filing, just a note clipped to the front page, in my grandmother's actual handwriting, which was small and precise, and which I recognized immediately. It said, "I know what Linda has been doing. I know you have been the one carrying it. I want this to go somewhere it won't be spent in Hammond. I'm sorry I ran out of time to say this in person." The second document in the envelope was a summary Genevieve had written herself, 5 pages, detailing what she had discovered, how she had discovered it, and the conversations she had attempted with my mother over the previous 18 months that had gone nowhere. It was written the way she spoke, direct and sequential and without editorializing. On the last page she had written, "I am telling you this because someone has to. Dorothea wanted you to have the truth at the same time you had the property, so neither one felt like a burden on its own." I set the envelope on my lap and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Here is the thing I have never told anyone about those 8 years, not the money part, the other part. I had believed on some level I was not willing to examine that my family's need for me was a form of love, that being necessary was the same as being valued, that the fact of my mother calling me when something was wrong meant something real about how she saw me. I had been so careful to make myself indispensable that I had confused indispensability with belonging. Grandma Dot had understood that about me. She had tried, I think, in the summer of my 14th year, and in small ways after that, to show me the difference. But I had not been ready to learn it until a truck jumped a Meridian on Lakeshore Drive, and I was lying in a hospital bay with 4 canceled transfers and an envelope from my grandmother sitting on the end of my bed. The family group thread kept buzzing. I turned it off. On day 3 in the hospital, Aunt Josephine texted me directly. I'll be honest about what I felt when her name appeared on my screen, which was nothing warm. Her message was 2 paragraphs about family obligation and what it means to be a daughter, written in the particular register of someone who has appointed themselves the moral center of a situation they are entirely wrong about. She used the phrase, "your poor mother," twice. She ended with a line that was clearly designed as a finishing blow, the kind of line people keep loaded for situations like this. She wrote, "Dorothea raised your mother with nothing, and she never complained. Your mother has done the same. Shame is not too strong a word here." I read that and felt the spreadsheet on the rolling tray table and felt the document in the envelope, and I made a decision about Josephine. Not today, I thought. Sunday, because my mother had, of course, called a gathering. The invitation came through the group thread 3 days after I left the hospital. A warm Sunday lunch at the Elmore Street house. Welcome the baby. Clear the air. Come together as family. My mother had written it in her best voice, the one that sounds like it belongs in a greeting card and smells like something is burning underneath. Danielle sent a separate text asking me if I was coming. She wrote, "I think Mom just needs to see you're okay. I think this whole thing has been a miscommunication." I read that word. Miscommunication. I had a fractured collarbone and 11 stitches and $365,000, and my mother had chosen bingo, and Danielle was calling it a miscommunication. I typed back, "I'll be there," and then I called Genevieve. We talked for 53 minutes. At the end, she asked me one question. "Do you want to manage this quietly, or do you want it witnessed?" I looked at Eli and his bouncer on the floor beside me, which was where I put him when I needed both hands and didn't want him out of my sight. "Witnessed," I said. "Then I'll bring the envelope," she said, "and I'll be early." Marcus knew me well enough not to ask too many questions when I told him the plan. He asked one, which was whether I was sure I could hold the line in that room. I said I had been holding lines in that room my entire life. I was just going to hold a different one this time. He folded the printed summary and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket where I wouldn't have to carry it. I packed the hospital bracelet in my coat pocket. The bracelet was soft by then, 5 days old, gone gray and a little worn at the edge. I had kept it because I was not ready to let go of it as evidence, the way a lawyer keeps a photograph, not because they need to look at it, but because they need to know it exists. That bracelet was the physical fact of the night my mother played bingo with Eli's grandmother's chair empty. Sunday came cold and clear. The Elmore Street house was exactly as I remembered it, which was the disorienting part, because I had loved that house my whole life, and now I knew what was actually in its walls. My grandmother's furniture, my grandmother's kitchen, my grandmother's composition notebooks, still on the shelf like a row of years. My mother had moved in 3 years ago when Grandma Dot's health declined, and I now understood had never been made to account for a single one of those years. Genevieve's car was already in the drive. I sat in the passenger seat for 1 minute, with Marcus's hand on my arm, and Eli in his car seat behind us, just breathing. Then I went in. My mother was in the kitchen. She came out with a dish in her hands and her welcome expression on, and for a moment the whole room did that thing it does. The performance of normalcy, everyone finding a reason to look elsewhere while they calibrated what was going to happen. Aunt Josephine was on the couch. 2 cousins stood near the window. My Uncle Bertrand sat at the end of the table, reading something on his phone, which was the most honest thing happening in the room. My father, who had remarried and lived in Memphis and almost never came to Chicago, was inexplicably there in a chair near the radiator, which told me my mother had made calls. Danielle was in the kitchen doorway, in a sweater I recognized from her most recent post, holding a mug. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. It was somewhere between sorry and wanting to be told everything was fine, so she could go back to not knowing things. My mother set the dish on the table, turned to the room, and opened. I want to say that because I think the truth deserves full accounting. She was a gifted performer in the specific register of the wronged mother. She spoke about how frightening my accident had been for her. She spoke about how she had been there for me my entire life. She touched on sacrifice without using the word, the way skilled people do. She looked at Eli in Marcus's arms and let her eyes film over at precisely the right moment. And then she turned to me and she said it. She said, "I have never understood the cruelty in you, Celestine. Your sister has never put me through this kind of thing. Your sister has never had these kinds of emergencies." She delivered it straight at me in a full room, and she had no idea she had just handed me the fulcrum. Because in this family, for 36 years, that sentence had always been a weapon. Your sister manages. Your sister doesn't make things difficult. Your sister is not like you. I had spent my whole life absorbing that sentence as a verdict, flinching under it, trying to earn my way out from under it. But I was a financial analyst who had just audited 8 years of her own life. I knew exactly why Danielle had never had these emergencies. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand. I reached into Eli's diaper bag, which I had set on the chair beside me, under the wipes, exactly where Marcus had placed it, and I took out the folded page. I unfolded it against my thigh with my right hand, the good one, smoothed the crease, and set it flat on the table in the light from the window. I said in the same voice I used to present a financial review to a board, "You're right. Danielle has never had these emergencies. I want to show everyone exactly why." The room went still, in the particular way rooms go still when they sense something irreversible is about to happen. I touched the first row. 8 years of transfers, I said. $365,000. Top section. What I can verify went where I intended it to go. $14,000 toward actual documented medical expenses. $18,000 toward this house's utilities and maintenance in the first 2 years before Mom negotiated the landlord down and stopped telling me. I moved my finger down the page. The rest, I said, breaks into 2 patterns. The first one maps to the Riverside Casino in Hammond. Geographically, I ran the withdrawal locations. The second goes to Danielle, including $9,000 moved under category labels that had nothing to do with Danielle, and a car note that's been running 3 years past the date the car was paid off. I set the page flat. I looked at my sister. "That's where your equipment came from, Danny," I said. "The studio deposit, Oaxaca, the card that got flagged at the spa. It came from me. It was always me. You didn't know that because nobody told you. I'm telling you now." My sister's face went through 4 things very quickly. Disbelief, recognition, something that looked like it might be shame, and then a long stillness. My mother opened her mouth, and that is when Genevieve set the envelope on the table. Genevieve set it down without ceremony, the way she did everything. A plain manila envelope beside my single printed page, the 2 of them side by side under the window light, like 2 pieces of a document that had always belonged together. My mother looked at the envelope and I watched her calculate. Genevieve said simply, "This is Dorothea's trust." The room shifted in a way I can only describe as gravitational. My Uncle Bertrand put his phone down. Aunt Josephine sat forward. Even my father, who had driven 7 hours and was supposed to be neutral scenery, went still in his chair. My mother said, What trust? Genevieve said, the one your mother established 16 months before she died, when she was still clear enough to know exactly what she was doing and why. My mother's voice thinned. She looked at me, then at Genevieve. Then at the envelope with the recognition of someone seeing a door they thought was locked standing open. That house, my mother said. This is her house. Genevieve said it was. The property, her accounts, and her investment portfolio are in trust. You and your brother have lifetime occupancy of the house as long as you maintain it. You have no ownership stake and no control of the financial assets. My mother said, that can't be right. Genevieve said, Dorothea had a lawyer in Evanston who specializes in exactly this kind of estate structure. She was very deliberate. The trust is clean. My mother turned to me, and I saw the shift, the moment the performer made a calculation and decided tears were no longer the right tool for this room. Her voice changed. It went cold in a way I had only heard once or twice before, usually right before she said something designed to break rather than persuade. You did this, she said. I said, Grandma did this. She did it before I knew she was doing it. Your grandmother would never have cut me out if you hadn't poisoned her against me. I had prepared for this one. I looked at her steadily and said, Genevieve has a 5-page document describing 2 years of conversations she tried to have with you. Grandma Dot had her lawyer working on this before she was ever sick enough to need full-time care. I was still sending you $1,400 a month the month she signed it. Nobody poisoned her. She had a ledger, and she knew how to read it. My mother turned to the room, to Josephine, to my cousins, to my father. She turned because she had always won in rooms. She had 30 years of experience winning in rooms through volume and performance, and the particular social pressure of being the aggrieved mother with an audience. But Josephine was looking at the single page on the table. And Josephine, I could see it happening, was doing arithmetic. Because Josephine had said the words, your mother has done the same. Had said my mother managed on her own. Had said shame is not too strong a word. And now the table in front of her contained 11 rows of evidence that my mother had not managed on her own, had not managed anything, had cashed $365,000 from her eldest daughter's salary, and called it family. My mother said, her voice rising, this is a performance. This is Celestine performing. This is what she does. She makes herself the victim. I said nothing. I left the page on the table.
The page was not performing. The page simply sat there being arithmetic. Danielle spoke, and her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. She said, Celestine, when you say it was always you, the monthly card, my camera, all of it. I looked at her. Yes, I said. She said, did Mom know I didn't know? I said, I think that was the point. My sister sat down on the arm of the nearest chair. She looked at her hands. She sat like that for a long time, while my mother continued speaking to the room, and Genevieve watched with her hands folded in her lap, and Marcus stood beside me with Eli in his arms, and said nothing, because he didn't need to. Here is what happened that Sunday in that room, because I want to give it to you precisely. My mother did not apologize. I want you to know that clearly and without softening, because I think if you are listening to this, and you have a mother like mine, you have been told your whole life that there will be a moment of reckoning, and it will look like remorse, and it will look like an apology, and everything will then be clear. That is not what happened, and I think the truth is more useful to you than a version with a cleaner ending. My mother moved through 4 stages. The first was denial. She told the room I had misrepresented the numbers, that the casino withdrawals had been for various purposes, that the transfers were repayment for expenses she had covered for me as a child, that I had conveniently forgotten. Genevieve said quietly that she had 4 years of my mother's bank statements, and was happy to go through them together, if anyone wanted to check the figures against mine. No one asked. The second stage was redirecting the hurt. She told my father that Genevieve had always hated her, and that this was simply a family score being settled. My father, who had driven up from Memphis apparently at my mother's request to serve as moral ballast, said a thing I did not expect. He said, Linda, I drove 7 hours. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this adds up. My mother looked at him the way she had always looked at people who stopped performing their assigned role. The third stage was the threat. She looked at me and said she would consult a lawyer about the trust, that Dorothea had not been of sound mind in her final years, that this could be contested.
Genevieve said, "The trust was executed 22 months ago. Dorothea's physician signed a capacity affidavit at the time of signing. Her attorney has had the file closed and clean since last spring. You are welcome to try." The fourth stage was the one that cost the most to witness. She turned to Danielle. She said, her voice now low and reaching for something genuine in the rubble of everything else. "I did it for you, Danny. Everything I did, I was protecting you. You know I always put you first." Danielle looked up. She said, "You made me live on my sister's money for 6 years without telling me." My mother said, "I was giving you what I never had." Danielle said, "You gave me someone else's money and made me think it was yours. That's not the same thing." I looked at my sister and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Not forgiveness, just the recognition that she was, at this moment, trying to tell the truth, and that it was costing her. My Uncle Bertrand, who had said nothing for the entire preceding 40 minutes, stood up and put his jacket on. He looked at my mother and said, "I'll be in the car." He looked at me and gave me a single nod, which I understood as the most he was willing to offer in this room, on this day. I accepted it. Aunt Josephine gathered her things quietly. She had not spoken since the page went on the table. She stopped beside me at the door and said, low, that she had not known.
I told her I understood, and I meant it, because the lie only works if the audience doesn't have the numbers, and she hadn't had them until today.
My father stopped me in the hall. He was 61, a little heavier than the last photograph I had of him, with the expression of a man who had spent 25 years making himself peripheral to avoid being recruited into conflict, and had just sat through 40 minutes of evidence that the conflict had existed at scale regardless. He said, "I should have checked in more, when you were small." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You turned out, though." I said, "I know. It was not a reconciliation. It was not nothing either. I filed it where it belonged." Marcus brought Eli to me in the hall, and I held him against my good shoulder, and I walked back through the kitchen toward the door, and I took one more look at the room. My grandmother's composition notebooks were still on the shelf, one for every year, a different spine color for each year, blue and green and red and black in a row. She had kept every one of them. She had taught me to read a bank statement at this table. She had done what she could with the time she had. I took the most recent notebook off the shelf, not as a statement, not as a performance, just because it was hers and I was the one she had given everything to, and it seemed like the right thing to carry out. My mother was still in the kitchen. She saw me take it. She said my name. I said, "I'll take care of it," which was true, and for the first time in 8 years, it was only true for myself. I pulled the front door shut behind me, softly. Slamming it would have meant I still wanted something from the room.
I didn't. The account was closed. Genevieve walked to her car beside me, and before she got in, she said she would have been pleased.
I said, "I know." She said, "She wanted you to have the truth at the same time you had everything else, so neither one of them would feel like a punishment." I said, she was right. She got in her car, and she drove away, and I stood on that sidewalk for a moment, with Marcus beside me, and Eli in his car seat, and my grandmother's notebook under my arm, and my hospital bracelet tucked in my coat pocket, and I breathed cold November air and did not feel triumphant. I felt, for the first time in 8 years, like the load I was carrying matched the actual size of my arms. That is all I wanted. Here's how it settled. The trust held. My mother's lawyer made 2 calls and received 2 consistent answers, which was that the document was clean and the capacity affidavit was solid, and there was very little to work with. The call stopped. She and my Uncle Bertrand continued to live in the Elmore Street house under the lifetime occupancy clause, which was what Grandma Dot intended. I am not in the business of removing elderly people from the houses they have lived in for decades. The financial assets and the property equity, however, are mine, in trust, managed by a fiduciary appointed by the original attorney. They go to Eli after me. The Riverside Casino in Hammond now runs without my margin. I understand that has not stopped the trips, only changed who funds them. That is no longer my department. My mother and I have not spoken since Sunday. I mean that without drama. She has called 4 times. I have not answered. This is not punishment. It is just an accurate reflection of the terms on which a relationship between 2 people is possible. And right now, No terms exist that make sense. Maybe they will someday.
But I am also not going to pretend it is a door that can open from only one side. Danielle and I have a different situation. She texted me 9 days after Sunday. The text was long and took me 3 readings to get through because it was written in the register of someone who has been sitting with something uncomfortable for 9 days and has finally decided to say it clearly. She said she was embarrassed. She said she had mistaken receiving for being loved, and that she understood now that there was a difference. She said she had asked Mom to explain it, and that the conversation had gone badly, and that she had decided to stop asking Mom to explain things and start reading the actual documents. She said, "Can I take you to dinner when you're feeling better?" I said yes. We had dinner 3 weeks later. She brought her camera, the one I had apparently paid for, which I chose not to mention. She asked me to tell her everything, and I did. Not all of it in one night, but enough that she left with a picture of it. She cried at the part about the car note. She said, "I thought I was getting good at being self-sufficient." I said, "You will be. You're already asking the right questions." She called me the following week to tell me she'd taken on 2 paying clients for portraits. Small ones. Not enough to live on, but hers. I said, "That's the one that feels different." She said, "Yeah, it really does." She is not the villain of this story. She was the person they kept at the top of the well, so nobody would have to admit there was a person at the bottom of it. I was at the bottom. Now I'm not. And now she knows where the water actually came from, and what it cost, and that knowledge is doing something to her that I think, given enough time, will make her someone worth knowing as a sister. Louisa, the night nurse from the agency, still sends Eli a card. She sent one when he turned 3 months, and when he turned 6 months, and I expect one on his first birthday. She was there. That counts for something I do not have a precise word for. Genevieve comes to dinner on the last Sunday of every month. She brings Grandma Dot's composition notebook from her own collection, the year she has been reading that month, and we go through a few pages together. The notebooks get less formal as the years go back. The early ones, the ones from when my grandmother was in her 20s, have a looser hand and wider margins, and sometimes whole pages of arithmetic that don't seem to be about anything except the pleasure of watching numbers balance. I understand that pleasure now more than I ever have. Marcus asked me once, about 4 months after Sunday, whether I wished I had done it sooner. I thought about it for a long time. I said, "I think I did it when I was ready to know what I would find." He said, "And?" I said, "And I think that's okay. Some receipts you have to earn the ability to read." He let that sit, and then he said, "Dot picked the right person." I said, "She picked the right bookkeeper." He laughed. Eli grabbed a fist of his collar. I watched them and felt, for the second time in my life, the specific uncluttered feeling of a spreadsheet that finally balances. There is one more thing. About 2 months after Sunday, I was going through Grandma Dot's most recent composition notebook, the blue one from the year before she died, and near the back, I found a page she had set apart from the rest. Not separated, just given more margin than the others, written in her smaller, careful hand. It said, at the top, "Things that compound," and then a list. Interest, she had written, debt, habit, silence. And at the bottom of the list, underlined twice, also, the right choice, given time. She had written it 14 months before she died. I tore the page out carefully and taped it inside the cover of my own ledger, which I started keeping in a composition notebook after the Sunday, one for every year going forward. Not because I need a ledger. I know how to run a spreadsheet. But because my grandmother kept them, and she was the steadiest person I have ever known, and some practices deserve to be carried. I keep the hospital bracelet in the top drawer of my desk at home. I don't need to look at it. I know it's there. That is enough. Eli is 8 months old now. He sleeps well and eats with enthusiasm, and has recently discovered that Marcus's face is the funniest thing that has ever existed, which is a characterization I find accurate. He does not know yet what his great-grandmother left him, or what his mother went through to be standing on the right side of it. He will know eventually. I'll tell him the way Grandma Dot told me things, at a kitchen table with a document in front of us, when he is old enough to read it the right way. If you feel my words, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, and tell me, from which city are you listening right now? I want to see how far a woman's voice can actually travel. Help me build this community, because we have so many more truthful stories to bring you, and every single one of them matters. I named my son Eli because it means ascension. Something lifted, something that has moved from where it was to somewhere higher.
My grandmother would have approved of the name. She would have approved of the notebook. She would have looked at that spreadsheet and said, 12 rows? That's it? Make it 13 so you have room to write what you learned. So I did. The 13th row just says, who shows up? No dollar amount, no date range, no category label. Just a column I am filling in slowly, one name at a time, for the rest of my life. Genevieve, Louisa, Marcus, Danielle, now. Harold, my grandfather, who drove past 3 exits before he believed a fender bender. And Grandma Dot, who ran out of time to say it in person, but made sure the paperwork could say it for her. That is the list that matters. That is the account that never goes empty. If you have a list like that, even a short one, even just one name on it, that name is worth more than any transfer you have ever sent. Read your statements tonight, not to find a betrayal, though you might, but to know clearly and without flinching what you are actually building and who you are building it for. Because the people who praise you for being the strong one have sometimes just found a quiet way to name the person they have decided they will never need to be strong for. And the day you close that account is the day you finally get to find out what you are actually worth, when nobody needs anything from you except to stay. That was my story. 8 years, 1 envelope, and 4 taps on a banking app. And a grandmother who knew the whole time and made sure the numbers would tell the truth long after she was gone. I need to go back further. I need to go back to the part I skipped over because I thought it was context, and it was actually foundation. The part about what my life had looked like in the 7 years before Eli was born. Because those years are the reason the number got as large as it got, and because understanding those years is the only way the rest of this makes full sense. Marcus and I met at 27 at a work event I almost didn't go to. I had been invited by a colleague and had canceled twice, and then gone on the 3rd attempt out of the specific social guilt that builds when you keep declining the same person's invitations. He was there because a client had asked him to attend, and he had shown up in the wrong jacket for the weather, and was standing near the coat check, looking annoyed at a draft. I remember thinking he seemed like someone with a sensible reason for everything he did, which turned out to be exactly right. We talked for 2 hours, and I canceled my cab twice. We were married at 29. We bought a small apartment on the north side that we could genuinely afford, which is a thing I want you to hear as the choice it was, because we could have bought more than we bought, and we chose not to. Marcus ran projections. I understood compound interest. We both understood that a margin is not a luxury. It is the thing that is standing between you and the version of your life where one emergency destroys everything. We chose the smaller apartment, the lower payment, the extra margin every month, and we chose it in part because I had already been sending transfers to my mother for 2 years by then, and the math worked better with a lower fixed cost. I told Marcus about the transfers in the 2nd year of our marriage. Not fully. I told him I helped my family out with expenses, that my mother had some health costs, that my sister was getting on her feet. He asked how much. I said around $1,500 a month. That was true in the 2nd year. By the 4th year, it was closer to $3,000. By the 6th, it was $3,800. I managed the accounts. I had always managed the accounts, and Marcus trusted me with the accounts the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. I had given him every reason not to. I had just made sure he never saw the reason. I want to stop here and say something clearly because I think it is the most honest part of this whole story. I was not deceived. Not entirely. My mother deceived me. She told me the money was going places it was not going. She moved funds under false labels and constructed a story about her own financial situation that I had no direct way to check, because I had made the mistake of assuming her word was sufficient evidence. But I had also deceived myself. I had known, on some level I chose not to examine, that the numbers did not fully add up. A thyroid condition does not cost $900 a month in prescriptions. A part-time pharmacy salary does not still require a $1,200 monthly supplement 6 years in. A car note does not run indefinitely. These were things I knew how to calculate, and I had chosen not to calculate them because calculating them meant knowing the answer. And knowing the answer meant being the kind of person who demands accountability from her mother. And I had spent my whole life being afraid of exactly that person. I was 34 years old, and I was afraid of my own math. The truck on Lakeshore Drive cured that. I think sometimes about what the story would have looked like if the accident hadn't happened. If I had gone on for another 2, 3, 5 years, the transfers would have continued. My mother would have continued managing her story. Danielle would have continued building a life on a foundation that wasn't hers without knowing it wasn't hers. And I would have continued being the reliable, invisible infrastructure that made all of that possible. Right up until Marcus and I eventually ran the real numbers on our retirement and found a hole that looked like 8 years of first-of-the-month transfers. Some people need a catastrophe to give them permission to read their own statements. I am apparently one of those people, and I have made my peace with that. What I have not made peace with, and probably never will entirely, is the specific night of the accident and the specific choice my mother made. It is not the casino that I keep coming back to. It is not even the transfers or the misdirection or the 8 years of careful financial maneuvering at my expense. Those things are large and wrong, and I have named them clearly, and I will not pretend otherwise. But there are betrayals of money, and there are betrayals of love, and they are not the same category, even when the same person commits both. She was 14 minutes away. 14 minutes. My son was 7 weeks old, and I was in a hospital bay, and she was 14 minutes away and she chose bingo. That is the sentence I keep returning to. Not the casino records, not the pivot table. The 14 minutes and the choice that filled them. I have thought a great deal about why that particular detail is the one that settled deepest, and I think the answer is this. The money could have been a mistake made out of weakness or denial, or the particular desperation of a woman who had been treated as invisible in her own childhood and developed a habit of taking from the one person she trusted not to leave. I could construct a version of the financial betrayal that has some complexity to it, some psychology, some sadness at the bottom. I cannot construct a version of the bingo night that has complexity at the bottom. That was not addiction. That was not desperation. That was a woman who looked at a scale with her daughter's emergency on one side and her own convenience on the other, and she chose her convenience. And she picked up the story she had been telling for 30 years about what kind of daughter Celestine was, and she used it as a weight on her side of the scale. Celestine manages. Celestine always manages. Celestine will be fine. That sentence was not a description of me, it was a decision about me. A decision my mother had been making since I was approximately 11 years old and capable of functioning without someone having to hold my hand through every difficulty, and which she had renewed and recommitted to every single time she made a choice that depended on it. I want to tell you something about the word manages because I used to think it was a compliment. I used to hear that word applied to me and feel a small private warmth, a confirmation that I was the kind of person who could be counted on, who did not fall apart, who was steady when everyone else was not. I wore it like a citation. Now I understand it differently. Managing is what you do when no one has offered to help. Managing is not a personality trait. It is an adaptation. It is the specific skill that develops in a person who has learned through enough repetitions that the help is not coming and the only way through is through on your own. Some people who develop that skill are grateful for it, and I am grateful for it. It has served me enormously. But the people who praised me for managing were not praising my resilience. They were relieved by it. Because a daughter who manages does not require anything from you. A daughter who manages is very convenient to have. I stopped being convenient on a Tuesday in November. I want to tell you about the days between the hospital and Sunday, because those days matter and I rushed through them in the earlier part of this story. I came home from the hospital on Thursday. Marcus had arranged everything, which is the specific, quiet, unremarked upon thing that good partners do when you are the person who usually arranges everything and your right arm is in a brace. The apartment was clean. There was food in a refrigerator, the kind I actually ate rather than the kind Marcus preferred. Louisa had left a detailed handoff note about Eli's feeding schedule, his preferences, his specific calming techniques, his sleeping patterns for the 3 nights she had been with him. She had written it in a composition book style, which I noticed. I read it twice on the couch, with Eli on my chest. My phone had 43 messages in it. 14 were from my mother. 7 were from Danielle. 11 were from relatives I had not spoken to since Christmas, and the remaining 11 were from colleagues and friends who had heard about the accident and were checking in without agenda, which is how you know the difference. I answered the 11. I did not answer the others, because I had a spreadsheet to build and a decision about Sunday to make, and I had learned, sometime around the third day in the hospital, that my energy was a resource with a real limit, and I was going to be deliberate about where I spent it. This was new for me. I had spent my entire adult life spending my energy on other people's problems first, and getting to my own afterward, if there was anything left. A therapist I had seen briefly at 31 had told me this was a pattern worth examining. I had examined it lightly, found the examination uncomfortable, paid for 8 sessions, and stopped going because I was busy. At the time I told myself the therapy hadn't been that useful. What I understand now is that the therapy had been extremely useful, and I had stopped going because the most useful part was pointing directly at something I was not yet willing to change. On Friday, Genevieve came by with 2 things, a container of soup and a file folder. The file folder was a supplementary document she had prepared after our hospital conversation, a timeline of what she had found and when, organized chronologically, the way a good accountant organizes everything, which is to say without sentimentality. I read it at the kitchen table while Marcus walked Eli in the living room, and the soup went warm on the stove. The timeline started 3 years ago, with my mother's phone call asking for a loan. Genevieve had noted the exact date, the exact amount requested, and the exact phrase my mother had used. She had written it in quotation marks in the margin of her own notes, the way you preserve something because you know it will be important later. The phrase was, "Don't worry about me, Genevieve, I have Celestine." I have Celestine. Not Celestine has been helping, not Celestine and I have an arrangement. I have Celestine. As if I were a resource, as if I were an account she could draw on. I read that line and felt something clarify inside me, the way a photograph clarifies when the developer finally works. I had been trying for 3 days to name the specific quality of what I felt about my mother. Not just the anger, which was there, and which I was not pretending otherwise, but the thing underneath the anger. The thing that made the bingo night hurt in a different register than the casino records. I have Celestine. She had not been taking from me, she had been leveraging me. There is a financial distinction that matters here. Taking implies guilt, implies some awareness of the cost, implies that the person doing the taking understands at some level that they are depleting a resource. Leveraging implies something colder. Leveraging is what you do when you see an asset and calculate what you can extract from it over time without the asset understanding what you're doing. I was 36 years old. I had run sophisticated financial models for companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and my mother had been leveraging me since I was 24 years old. The timeline in Genevieve's folder ran for 4 pages. I will not give you every detail, because some of it is not mine to share. But I will give you the part that surprised me most. On the 3rd page, about 2/3 down, there was a note about a conversation Genevieve had had with my grandmother 18 months before she died. Grandma Dot had called her on a Sunday afternoon and had been uncharacteristically direct. She had said, "I need you to help me figure out where Celestine's money is actually going, because something Linda said doesn't add up, and I am not going to die without knowing." She had said that last part simply without drama. I am not going to die without knowing, as if it were a logistical item on a list, as if she were a person who arranged her affairs in order, and dying without the truth correctly filed was a kind of untidiness she was not willing to leave behind. That was my grandmother. That was entirely my grandmother. Genevieve had said she would look into it, and she had, and what she had found she had brought to Grandma Dot carefully and over time, so as not to overwhelm her. The last conversation they had had on the subject was 6 weeks before Dot died. Genevieve had come over with the final summary, the one with the casino cluster and the Danielle subcategory, laid out as cleanly as she could make it. She had sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my grandmother had taught me to read a credit card statement. And she had spread the documents out. Grandma Dot had looked at them for a long time. Then she had gone to her shelf of composition notebooks and taken one down, the most recent one, and opened it to a blank page and started writing. Genevieve said she had written for 15 minutes without speaking. When she stopped, she closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf and said, "The trust is already drafted. I called the lawyer in November. It just needed this, and now I have it." She had looked at Genevieve and said, "Make sure Celestine gets the most recent notebook." That was the last time they had spoken about it. 6 weeks later,
Grandma Dot died in her sleep in the Elmore Street house. My mother called me with the news, and I drove 4 hours from Chicago, in a grief so clean and immediate, it felt like it belonged to a different life than the one I'd been living. I grieved my grandmother without complicated feelings for a full week. I sat with the relatives and answered questions and held my mother's hand when she cried at the graveside with the specific efficiency of a person who has learned to process grief in the margins of other responsibilities. And then I went home and went back to work and sent the first-of-the-month transfer the way I had sent every first-of-the-month transfer for 8 years. Because Grandma Dot was gone, and she was the only person who had known the truth, and now the truth was simply gone with her. Except it wasn't, because she had made sure it wasn't. She had a lawyer in Evanston and a trustee in Genevieve, and a composition notebook on a shelf in the Elmore Street kitchen, and she had made absolutely certain that what she knew would survive her. I sat with that for a long time on Friday with the soup going warm, and Marcus in the next room, and the timeline open on the table. My grandmother had done for me, posthumously, what I had spent 22 years wishing someone would do. She had read the numbers. She had followed the money. She had sat at the same table where she taught me to read a bank statement, and she had applied everything she taught me to the situation I was too close to apply it to myself. And then she had gone to a lawyer and signed a document and put a notebook on a shelf and trusted that the right person would eventually be ready to look. She did not know about the accident. She died a year before Eli was born. She never met Marcus. She never saw me in the hospital bay with the monitor counting my pulse and the banking app glowing bluish-white in the dark. But she knew what kind of woman I was, and she knew that eventually the person who had been taught to read a statement would read her own. I closed the folder on Friday evening and sat in the kitchen for a long time after Marcus had put Eli down. Outside, Chicago was cold and dark and entirely indifferent. Inside, there was a pot of Genevieve soup and a folder on the table, and a composition notebook in my bag that I had not opened yet. Small and precise, blue ink, the slightly formal hand she used for official entries. I turned to the last written page, the one Genevieve had watched her write. It was dated 6 weeks before she died. At the top, she had written a single line. It was not addressed to me. It did not need to be, because she had always understood that I would find it, and that by the time I found it, I would understand exactly what she meant. The line said, "The well does not run dry. The person carrying the bucket gets tired." Below it, in a slightly looser hand as if she had paused and come back. I should have said this out loud, and saying it now. I closed the notebook. I held it in my lap and said nothing for a long time. Some truths you have to carry for a while before they settle into the right place. That one settled somewhere near my sternum, which is where all the important ones go. Saturday, Danielle called again. I had not answered her calls since Tuesday. She had left 2 voicemails and 3 texts, all in the register of someone who is beginning to sense that something larger than a card dispute has happened, and does not yet have the vocabulary for it. The most recent text had been that morning. It said, "I keep thinking about what you said on the phone, about where it comes from. Did you mean you've been paying for things for me?" It had a question mark at the end that felt less like punctuation and more like a small, careful knock on a door. I called her back. We talked for 40 minutes. I did not tell her everything, not yet. I told her enough. I told her that the monthly card was not a family account in the way she had understood it, that the money came from my income, that I had been sending it through our mother under different labels for years. I told her the totals would be on a piece of paper on the table on Sunday, and that I wanted her to hear it from me before she heard it in a room. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Did you know I thought Mom had an inheritance? From some account nobody talked about?" She told me once that Grandma Dot had left a small fund that covered things. I said, "Grandma Dot's fund is going to be one of the other documents on the table." Another silence, longer. She said, "Celestine, I'm sorry." I said, "You don't need to apologize for not knowing something you were deliberately kept from knowing." She said, "I should have asked more questions." I said, "Yes, but so should I." That was the most honest conversation Danielle and I had ever had, and it lasted about 40 minutes and covered more real ground than the previous 29 years of sisterhood, which tells you something about the cost of performing normalcy
when normalcy is a fiction everyone has agreed to maintain.
She asked if she should come to Sunday dinner. I said yes.
I said I needed her in the room, not as an ally, but as a witness, and that there was a difference, and that I trusted her to understand the difference when the time came.
She said, "I'll be there." She was there.
I already told you what happened that Sunday. The dish on the table, and the welcome expression, and the performance, and the sentence the fourth time that sentence. Your sister has never had these kinds of emergencies. But I want to go back inside that moment, because there was something that happened in the 3 seconds before I reached into the diaper bag that I did not describe fully before, and which matters. When my mother said that sentence, standing in the middle of the room she had been managing for 30 years, with the relatives assembled, and the dish on the table, and Eli in Marcus's arms, and the whole performance at its peak, she looked at me with an expression I had seen my entire life. Cruelty implies malice, implies a kind of consciousness about the wound being inflicted. What I saw in my mother's face in that moment was something older and more settled than cruelty. It was certainty. She was certain that sentence would work. She had deployed it 4 times in 7 days, because it had worked every time she had deployed it for 30 years, and she had no reason to believe this time would be different. She was certain that I would absorb it, that I would feel the sting of the comparison, that I would spend the next 45 minutes trying to explain myself, or apologize, or negotiate the temperature in the room down to something manageable for everyone, the way I had always done. She had no idea that I had stopped being the person who did that. She had no idea that the woman she had raised to manage things had spent 5 days managing an audit of the last 8 years of her own life and had come to a table with the results. That certainty on her face, that absolute confidence that the room was hers and the outcome was determined, is the thing I see most clearly when I replay that Sunday. Because I watched it leave. I watched it go in the specific way certainty leaves a face when the thing it was certain about stops being true. Not in a crash, not in a single dramatic moment, in a slide, a slow recalibration happening in real time, as I took out the page and smoothed it flat and set it on the table and started talking in my quarterly review voice. There is a satisfaction in that, which I am not going to pretend I didn't feel. I will not apologize for that satisfaction either. I had funded her certainty for 8 years. I was entitled to watch it go. What I was not prepared for, because some things you cannot prepare for no matter how good your spreadsheet is, was Danielle. I had expected Danielle to be confused at the table. I had expected her to need time and ask questions and go through a process that would take weeks or months or possibly years. I was not prepared for her to turn to my mother and say what she said. "You gave me someone else's money and made me think it was yours." 9 words, delivered in a voice so level it sounded almost clinical. I had been in rooms with my sister for 29 years. I had heard her argue and cry and laugh and negotiate and perform and sulk. I had never once heard that voice. That was the voice of a woman who has just understood something clearly for the first time and is choosing to say it exactly as it is, without padding, without softening, without managing anyone's reaction. That was the voice of someone choosing not to manage. I recognized it. I thought in that moment, sitting in the Elmore Street house with the page on the table and the envelope open, and my grandmother's composition notebook in the bag at my feet. She's going to be okay. Not today, maybe not for a while, but she is going to be okay. There is something else I need to tell you about Sunday that I left out the first time through. Not because it isn't important, but because it is the hardest part and I wanted to build up to it the right way. My mother's 4th stage, the one I called the one that cost the most to witness, was when she turned to Danielle and said, "I did it for you." I sat with those words. After Sunday, I sat with them for weeks, because they were true in their way. They were the truest thing she said all afternoon. She had not grown up as the favorite. She had grown up as the responsible one, the managing one, the invisible infrastructure of her own mother's house. She had watched her brother be loved with the warmth that was withheld from her. She had carried and covered and enabled and been praised for her practicality, in exactly the way I had been praised for mine. And when she had children of her own, she had done the only thing she knew how to do, which was replicate the structure exactly but assign herself the role she had always wanted. She made Danielle the beloved one. She made me the load-bearing wall. She rebuilt the architecture of her own childhood with herself in the one position she had never been allowed to occupy. My therapist, the one I finally went back to see 4 months after Sunday, said this with more clinical precision and without the spreadsheet metaphors, but the shape of it is the same. My mother was not a cartoon. She was a woman in pain who had never been given the tools to move through that pain in a way that didn't cost other people. And the cost had been paid, for 8 years, first of every month, by me. Understanding that does not change what I did. I am not in the business of explaining away real harm with psychological context. $365,000 is $365,000, regardless of the childhood that produced the person who took it. My son's college fund would have been different. My retirement would have been different. 3 years of my life would have looked different. But I am able to hold two true things at the same time, which is, my mother harmed me, and my mother was also harmed. And the fact of the second truth does not negate the first one, and the first truth does not require me to hate her, just to be finished funding her. I am finished. That is a complete sentence. Grandma Dot understood this too, I think. She had been the unloved wall in her own house, and she had chosen, when she finally had real agency, to name the person doing the carrying and leave them something real. Not because my mother was a villain requiring punishment, but because the correct thing to do when you see a system built on someone else's sacrifice is to stop the system, not applaud it. She stopped it the only way available to her, with a lawyer in Evanston and a trustee and a composition notebook on a shelf. I finished the job with a banking app and a printed page and a seat at a table she had taught me to read things at. I think she would have liked the symmetry of that. There is a detail I have been holding back because it is personal in a way the rest of the story isn't, and I want to give it to you now because you have stayed with me this long and you have earned the whole thing. The Tuesday after Sunday, 5 days after the dinner, I went back to the Elmore Street house. I did not call ahead. I knew my mother was there. I knew this might be a version of a conversation I had already decided not to have. I went anyway because there was something I needed from the kitchen shelf, and I had decided that needing a thing and being afraid of the encounter required to get it were no longer sufficient reasons to leave the thing on the shelf. I went mid-morning. I parked on the street. I knocked, which I had never done in 30 years because children do not knock on their grandmother's door, but I knocked this time because I was not coming as a child. My mother opened the door. We looked at each other. She was smaller than she had seemed on Sunday. Not physically, her height had not changed, but the particular quality of size that comes from certainty was gone. She looked like a woman who had been sitting with something uncomfortable for 5 days and had not slept well. I said, "I'm not here to fight." She said, "Then why are you here?" I said, "I need the notebooks." A pause. I watched her process this. The whole shelf of them. She stepped back from the door and I walked through the kitchen and went to the shelf. There were 22 of them, a different spine color for each year going back to the year my grandmother started keeping them. I took them all. My mother watched from the kitchen doorway without speaking, while I put them carefully in the box I had brought, one at a time, spine up so the spines could be read. She watched me carry the box to the door. I stopped at the threshold. I said, "The most recent one goes to Genevieve when you find things that need Genevieve." She said nothing. I said, "The occupancy clause in the trust means this is your home as long as you take care of it. I want you to know that I don't have any intention of making that difficult." She said very quietly, "Why are you being decent about it?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Because being decent about it was Grandma Dot's way, and I am trying to be more like her." My mother's face did something then that I do not know how to describe, except to say it was the only moment in that week, in that whole 7 days, when she looked her actual age, not the performer, not the wounded matriarch, just a 63-year-old woman standing in a kitchen, realizing she had run out of moves. I picked up the box, and I walked out. I put the box in the back seat, and I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, and I breathed. Then I drove home to Marcus and Eli, and the apartment we had bought for the right reasons, and I put the notebooks on the shelf in my own kitchen, and I went to feed my son. There were 3 more things that happened in the months after Sunday that belong in the story. The first was that Genevieve found, in reviewing the trust documents with the Evanston attorney, that Grandma Dot had set aside a separate small account I had not known about. It was a direct payable account.
already designated, requiring only a death certificate to release. The amount was $42,000. Enough, as Genevieve put it with characteristic dryness, for someone to know that they are not starting over from zero. The note attached to it was shorter than the one in the trust. It said only, for the work years. You know which ones. I do know which ones. The second thing was a call I received 8 weeks after Sunday, from a cousin I will call Renata, one of the two cousins who had stood near the window at the dinner and said nothing throughout. She called on a Wednesday evening and asked if I had time to talk. I said yes. She said, I have been sending my parents money every month for 5 years, not as much as you, but enough. She did not ask me anything. She did not need to. She just needed to say it to someone who would understand immediately and completely, without needing it explained. I said, I hear you. She said, I don't know yet what I'm going to do. I said, you don't have to know yet. You just have to know. We talked for an hour. She did not ask me what she should do, and I did not tell her. I told her what I had done and why, and what the math looked like, and what came after. I told her about the spreadsheet and what it felt like to look at the total. I told her about the 4 taps. At the end she said, does it get quieter after? I said, yes, but not all at once. It gets quieter the way a room gets quieter after a refrigerator stops running. You don't notice how loud it was until it stops. And then the absence is so big, it almost sounds like something. She said, that's exactly what I needed to hear. I thought about her for a long time after we hung up, about how many versions of this story are running right now in households across every city in the country. How many women are sitting at a kitchen table or a parking garage or a hospital bed looking at a number they have been not looking at for years? How many grandmother substitutes there are sitting at kitchen tables trying to figure out who is carrying the bucket? The third thing was smaller and larger at the same time. About 3 months after Sunday, on a Saturday morning in February, when Marcus had taken Eli to his parents for the afternoon, and I had the apartment to myself, I opened my own composition notebook, the first one, the one I had started keeping after the Sunday. I had been writing in it the way Grandma Dot wrote in hers, just the numbers, the monthly review, the account balances, the trajectory. But on this particular Saturday I turned to a blank page, and I wrote something that was not a number. I wrote what I would tell my 24-year-old self, and then I sat and thought about it for a while. Because the obvious answer is, do not send the first transfer. If you do not send the first one, there is no second one, there is no 8 years, there is no $365,000. The obvious answer is correct, but the obvious answer is not the whole answer. The whole answer is longer and harder, and this is what I wrote. I wrote, the first transfer was not the mistake. The first transfer was an act of love toward people I believed needed it. And love is not a mistake even when it is misplaced. The mistake was the year I could see the math was not adding up, and I chose not to look at the line items. That was the year the choice became a choice to not know. And the years after that were not transfers sent in love, they were transfers sent in avoidance, in the decision to not be the kind of person who asks hard questions about where the money goes. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote, the love was real, the accounting was wrong. And then, beneath it, because I had been carrying it since the night in the hospital bay with the monitor and the blue-white screen, being the person who manages is not a crime. Being the person who lets you manage without ever asking what it costs is a kind of theft. The difference is important, and I spent 36 years not understanding it, and I am not going to lose another day failing to name it correctly. I closed the notebook and put it on the shelf with the 22 that belonged to my grandmother. They looked right there. They looked like something that had been waiting for the rest of itself. Eli is not quite a year old as I finished telling you this. He has just learned that if he pulls on the shelf edge, he can leverage himself to standing, which delights him and concerns me in roughly equal measure. He does not know yet that the shelf he keeps grabbing is where his great-grandmother's life's work lives. He doesn't know that the composition notebooks lined up in their colors are a record of 31 years of a woman who understood money and chose to use that understanding to protect the people she loved even after she was gone. He will know. I will sit him at a kitchen table the way I was sat at a kitchen table when he is old enough to understand what a statement is and what a line item means,
and why the column labeled Who Shows Up is the one that actually determines what your life looks like. I will hand him the most recent notebook, mine, and I will show him that his mother kept one too, and I will tell him that the thing about numbers is not that they are cold. The thing about numbers is that they are honest in a way that most other things in life are not. And honesty is not cold. Honesty is a form of care, and the people who love you enough to give you the true number instead of the comfortable one are the people worth keeping. That is what my grandmother gave me. That is what I intend to give my son. If you feel my words right now, if something in this story has touched the place in you that recognizes itself, then do something for me.
Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment below telling me which city you are in right now.
I want to know how far a woman's voice can carry when she finally decides to use it. I want to see this community grow, because the stories are not finished. There are more of them. There are so many more women who have been carrying buckets they were never supposed to carry alone, and every one of them deserves to have someone say out loud what the numbers actually say. Help me build this community, because the next story is already waiting, and it belongs to someone just like you. I want to end where I always intended to end, which is with the hospital bracelet. It is in the top drawer of my desk. I know exactly where it is. It is worn soft at the edges, and the print on it is mostly faded now. Just the ghost of my name and my date of admission and the unit number pressed into the plastic. It does not take up much space. It is not a dramatic object. If you didn't know what it was, you would throw it away without a second look. I know what it is. It is the night I was in a hospital bed with a fractured collarbone and 11 stitches and my son 7 weeks old, 14 minutes from a grandmother who chose bingo. It is the night I looked at a number I had been not looking at for 8 years and made myself look.
It is the night I pressed cancel 4 times on a banking app in the dark and heard the silence that came after, and understood for the first time in my adult life that the silence was not emptiness. It was room. Room for the version of myself that had been waiting, quietly and without complaint, behind the faucet, behind the transfers, behind the spreadsheets I ran for other people, and the math I refused to run for myself. The bracelet is a receipt. It is the receipt for everything that came before and everything that came after. I keep it because I am a woman who reads her statements, and some statements you keep. That was my story. 8 years, 1 envelope, 4 taps, and a grandmother who made sure the numbers would tell the truth, long after she ran out of time to say it herself. If you are the strong one in your family, read your statement tonight. Not because you will necessarily find what I found. Maybe you will find that everything is exactly as you believed it was. Maybe you will find something smaller, or something different, but read it. Because being willing to look is the beginning of being the person who knows, and being the person who knows is the only way to make a real choice about what comes next. And if someone in your life has been calling you dependable and reliable, and the one who manages for so long that you have started to think of those words as your name, I want you to hear me say this clearly. Those are not your name. Those are descriptions of what you have been doing in the absence of someone who should have been doing it with you. You are allowed to set the bucket down. You are allowed to let someone ask where the water went. You are allowed to hand them a page with 11 rows on it, and wait in silence while they read. The account that matters, the only one that has ever mattered, is the one in the 13th row. Who shows up? That is the only balance worth building.